This is Outnumbered. I'm Harris Faulkner. Here today, Meghan McCain, host of Kennedy on the Fox Business Network. Kennedy! Republican strategist and Fox News contributor Lisa Booth. And today's hashtag One Lucky Guy. We welcome back Judge
Merry
Alex
Christmas.
Barrere. Aww, on the day after. And he's outnumbered. Hey, great to have you.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, we
Everybody looks
appreciate
wonderful.
you
Look at this.
flying in on the back of Santa's sleigh as he was finishing out yesterday.
Hanging on.
All right. Glad you made it here safe.
I'm glad to be here. This is always fun.
All right.
Especially on Boxing Day.
That's what I was going to say.
All right. Well, here's another day. The inauguration. And it's less than a month away from now, and the president-elect faces some daunting deadlines and issues that were front and center during the campaign and the transition. On the list, Obamacare, illegal immigration, and nominating someone to replace the late Justice Antonin Scalia on the U.S. Supreme Court. The Trump team released a list of people under consideration for that job, and in one of the presidential debates, he named Dianne Sykes and Bill Pryor. Those justices are still considered frontrunners for the spot. William Pryor is on the 11th Circuit in Birmingham, Alabama. That's also home of Mr. Trump's nominee for Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Pryor is a staunch critic of the Roe v. Wade abortion decision. Dianne Sykes is on the 7th Circuit Court in Chicago. She's a big supporter of the Second Amendment rights, but some point to her age, 59, as a liability when it comes to a lifetime appointment. And while he's not officially on any list, another name being floated, you may recall him being called Lion Ted a few times. Senator Ted Cruz, who once clerked for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. Mr. Trump will have a Republican majority in the Senate, but Democrats will likely mount quite the confirmation battle. Some Democratic senators say they will give Trump's nominee the so-called Garland treatment to retaliate for Republicans' delay tactics used to block President Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland. So, out of all of those names, what can you tell us?
Well, they're all very intelligent and very accomplished, and of course they're all conservative. Obviously, had Hillary won, we'd be looking at very intelligent and very accomplished nominees as well, or potential nominees, but from a different philosophical viewpoint. Sykes, I think, would be a great choice. I think she'd be an excellent choice. You know, one of the things that people don't consider is, in addition to their judicial philosophy, you want a jurist who can communicate to the others, because a lot of what happens is, and I don't want to call it horse trading, but you know, a lot of the justices, when they get into caucus, they need to be able to convince the other justices, look, you know, my viewpoint is the one you should adopt instead of taking off in this other tangent. And, you know, being controversial, being conflicted, I know Ted Cruz's name was mentioned. He's also very, very smart and brilliant guy. But he does have a tendency to be controversial. Now, Dianne Sykes has a reputation for being very personable and charming and approachable and likable. And that goes a long way in winning votes over to your side.
All right, so that's how it could go if it goes well. If the Democrats, Lisa, decide to put up much of a fight, how ugly could that get?
I think it could get pretty ugly, because they are going to keep the fact that, you know, Republicans sort of held up the process with Merrick Garland. And so I think it's going to be personal. And this is an area where, you know, they truly can try to block some of, you know, whoever Donald Trump ends up selecting here. Because if you look at the cabinet choices, because of changes that the Democrats made and that Harry Reid made, Donald Trump, as long as he keeps the Republican line, can pretty much get anyone through on the cabinet choices that he wants. But I actually think that Senator Ted Cruz could be a good choice from a political standpoint, because Senator Cruz has already sort of tipped his hat to the fact that he may be a nuisance of sorts to President-elect Donald Trump.
Sure.
So this is one way of someone who's going to strictly adhere to the Constitution, have those conservative values, and you sort of get him out of the way politically.
All right. How about a real basic question, though, about Ted Cruz? How do you have a guy who you named Lion Ted on the highest court in the land?
I think old wounds from campaigns can heal. When you're talking about getting debatably the least popular senator out of the Senate, I don't think he'd have anybody putting up much of a fight. They probably want him out and on the Supreme Court. I've grown to like Ted Cruz a lot more than I ever did in the past year, and I think people could move on. Because I was one of those, as you know, I was not a huge Trump supporter throughout the entire election, and I thought he was speaking for a lot of us that, you know, hold true to our conservative beliefs that had questions about Donald Trump, and I ended up liking him more than I would have. I was the one person who defended him on this very show at the convention after his drop the mic speech. So I learned to like like him a lot more than I once did. But I actually think it's a great choice politically as well. He's very well aligned, with conservatives across the country. And when you're talking about issues like Second Amendment rights and Roe versus Wade, these are hot-button cornerstone issues that he adheres well to.
So, Kennedy, that's what I want to ask you about. There's certain ways that a Supreme Court can have a lot of influence on our lives as citizens.
Certainly.
What are some of the big issues that you think we'll look forward to seeing this court tackle?
Well, I do think that Roe v. Wade will be an incredibly important issue, and I think that's going to come up a lot, especially if Pryor is nominated. I agree with the judge. I would like to see Dianne Sykes have her day in court, or in the Senate, as it were, because I think that you need someone who's really strong on the Second Amendment. And also, I want to see how much of a constitutionalist she really is. And I think there are some really important questions that both sides need to ask. And one of the things that President-elect Trump has promised to do is put not only a constitutionalist, but an originalist up in that all-important robe. And I think that's very critical at this point, when we have so many issues that are still, because we've had this split court, whether it's immigration, marijuana still has a lot of vetting to be done on the state level versus the federal level.
Right.
And we'll see if the court will take something like that up again. But to Megan's point, Ted Cruz, he is a constitutionalist. This is not a political appointment for him. And I think it would be very interesting to see what he would do as a jurist versus as a politician.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to see how it ultimately all plays out. All right, meantime, as a new president and a new Congress take office in January, among the most pressing issues will be the future of Obamacare. Donald Trump, on the campaign trail and in the weeks since the election, has repeatedly promised to repeal and replace President Obama's signature legislative achievement in his first term.
Real change begins with immediately repealing and replacing the disaster known as Obamacare. Insurers are fleeing, doctors are quitting, and deductibles are going through the roof. Yet Hillary Clinton wants to double down on Obamacare. I'm asking for your vote so we can repeal and replace Obamacare and save health care for every family in New Hampshire and in our country.
However, despite his vow to get rid of Obamacare, President-elect Trump has hinted at keeping some of its most popular provisions, like the pre-existing conditions clause and allowing those younger than 26 to remain on their parents' insurance. Kennedy, I'm going to go to you. Do you think anything less than a complete and utter repeal of Obamacare, do you think his core base will be angered?
I don't know if they're going to be angered. They have a way of rationalizing some of the decisions that he's made. But I tend to agree with the base on this one. I would like to see the whole thing scrapped, because I think it's so expensive. We've seen so much consolidation alone. And these health service providers, doctors have been consolidating with these giant conglomerates. And that's one thing that has really compromised healthcare and made it more expensive, and also offered fewer choices. A lot of people, especially on the left, like to say 20 million people are now insured. Well, most of those people are actually on Medicaid. And, they're not serviced by private insurance at all. So many private insurers are pulling out of it. So I think, if you try and just hack off pieces of it, it's going to bleed to death anyway. So you may as well start over with an entirely new process. And I think that Senate Democrats will be on board with that if they truly care about Americans getting good health care in this country.
Yeah, that's a $64,000 question, Judge, is will they ultimately help Donald Trump repeal and then replace it? Because even Democrats have admitted at this point it is a disaster.
This is going to be a battle among Democrats, because they don't want to be seen as supporting the demise of Obamacare. But there are Democrats that are up for re-election in 2018 in key states that are going to be difficult for them to win if they oppose Donald Trump. So he's probably going to get some support on this. Now, it's not going to be easy, though. Remember, Obamacare was instituted during Obama's first term. It's been around and building and growing tentacles into everything. This is not something that's going to be flipped immediately. It's going to certainly not be done in the first year. It's going to take probably a couple years to do. And I think the question is going to be, what does he replace it with? Because if he replaces it with something worse, he's in serious trouble. I think the idea that he's floated about opening up interstate competition is key to this. The idea that insurance companies can't compete between states is crazy, because that's where you're going to get the lowest prices, and that's
Right.
where you're going to get the best deals.
You know, Lisa, I want to go to you on this. Again, if it's not completely repealed, if he keeps some of the mandates that we were talking about earlier, like 26-year-olds being able to stay on their parents' plans, is there going to be outrage from his supporters?
You know, potentially, but I do think that there is pressure on Democrats that are facing, you know, tough 2018 elections to potentially play ball here, especially depending on what Republicans end up putting forward. Because you look, I think there's at least 5 states where Donald Trump won by double digits. And so those guys could potentially have a tough 2018. But also looking at 2018, Republicans really need to try to get this done in the first 2 years. Because if there's any lesson under President Obama, when a party controls this much power, even though the map looks really good for Republicans, you just don't know. And this is something that Republicans have promised repeatedly to voters. And it absolutely has to get done, or I just don't know how voters are going to be able to trust Republican candidates
That's a good
again.
point, because it was really a down ballot issue. It wasn't just about Donald Trump and the presidency. I would say that the Republicans need to be careful going forward. They have got to have a plan that looks better than the one that we have right now, and how to protect those people who are 26 and, you know, or pre-existing conditions, I think, is probably the example that I would give, that you would have to protect that going forward to make sure. And the other thing is that the IRS is running this baby. Like they've been the revenue capture for all of this. And so now you've got to figure out, are you going to continue to let the Internal Revenue Service run this, or is it going to be, you know, revenue-wise very different? So there's some big questions to answer before you repeal it. What is that replacement going to look like?
That's a really good point, because Steve Mnuchin, who's the incoming Treasury Secretary, at least the nominee at this point, will have as much say as someone like Tom Price at Health and Human Services.
All right, a lot of questions about what President-elect Trump is going to do about illegal immigration once he's in the White House. Remember, we're talking about the first 100 days now. One of his big campaign promises was building a wall. Remember that? We'll get Mexico to pay for it. He brought it up in just the past few weeks.
We will build a great wall, and we will stop illegal immigration for once and for all. Going to build that wall. We're going to build a wall. It's going to be a great wall, and it's going to have big, beautiful doors in it, because we're going to have people coming into our country. But they're going to come into our country legally.
But in a 60 Minutes interview after Election Day, Mr. Trump sounded like he was walking it back a bit. Well, we'll just read you the quote, you decide. But certain areas, a wall is more appropriate. I'm very good at this. It's called construction. There could be some fencing. Before the election, Mr. Trump also talked about deporting illegal immigrants.
Anyone who has entered the United States illegally is subject to deportation. That is what it means to have laws and to have a country. Otherwise, we don't have a country.
Also in that 60 Minutes interview that aired November 13th, it sounded again like he was softening his stance, saying this: what we are going to do is get the people that are criminal and have criminal records, gang members, drug dealers, where a lot of these people, probably 2 million it could be, even 3 million, we are getting them out of our country, or we are going to incarcerate. Okay, that last part, you were a police officer before you were a judge, so that incarceration, we could see lots of numbers of people if it's really 2+ million people.
Yeah.
What does the deportation reality look like?
Well, the deportation reality of 11 million, it looks very
We're talking
unlikely.
specifically about the criminals. Because I want to know why it's not happening now in bigger droves.
Well, there's probably a few reasons why it's not happening now. That's not the focus of this administration. But one of the things I think that Trump could do that would kill 2 birds with 1 stone is pair up immigration with the gang units across the country. There's so many gangs out there that are stocked with illegal immigrants and are just decimating communities. Pair up with those gang units and just sweep across the country, ripping those gangs apart. Those are deportations nobody would argue against. Who would say, no, we want to keep a gang member here? And you could clear out so many criminals at the same time as you're dealing with the fact that they're here illegally. That would be the first step I would recommend. As far as his wall, frankly, if he seals that southern border, people aren't going to care if it's a wall, a fence, or a bunch of angry grandmothers with rolling pins. As long as that border is sealed, they're going to be happy that it was sealed, regardless of all the talking back and forth about whether it's a wall or a fence or electronic surveillance or whatever. Right now, we have a section of the lower United States of about 1,100 miles. That's the distance from Miami to New York. Right. That is completely open.
Yeah.
Completely open.
All right, so we have homes on the border state of Arizona. You grew up there, and so I've got family there as well. We know this issue. Nogales, down in those areas that are so porous, we know this issue well.
Yeah, I mean, this is the most emotionally turbulent issue, I think, that exists in the United States in current American politics. I've never seen people react the way they do to issues on illegal immigration. Donald Trump ran. First speech he ever made, coming down those golden stairs at Trump Tower saying, you know, illegal immigrants were criminals and rapists, promising to build this wall. And much like the question we posed in the last segment, if he doesn't deport all these illegal immigrants, and we had Judge Napolitano on the couch who said it would cost $250,000 per illegal immigrant to deport them. If he doesn't go up on this promise and end up deporting everyone, will his base of supporters care? And the devil is in the details on this, the logistics on this. When you're talking about DREAM Act students, when you're talking about people staying here on extended visas illegally, there's a lot of nuance in this, and it's not just criminals and rapists. And I'll be curious to see how people react to it, because I just don't see how it's logical for him to deport all 11 million illegal immigrants.
But I think he's also already signaled a change in this administration, obviously based on all the rhetoric and the things that he said throughout the campaign, but also in his cabinet choices, because General Kelly is going to approach this from a military standpoint. This is someone who's very familiar with Latin America. This is someone who has worked in the Middle East, who's going to see the southern border as a possible, threat to our nation from a, potential terrorist activity. And so I think that approach is going to be different. In regards to the wall, I think there's going to be the will of Congress in potentially doing it. I believe there's existing law that Donald Trump could utilize, but he's going to have to appropriate the money from Congress. So there is going to have to be